Hello everyone, it's Rob here. Listen, it's YouTube. You know what to do. Hit the bell and the thumbs up, right? Okay, I'll talk to you later. Bye. So here's his speech from right before the Iraq War. And notice Jezza behind him.
Easy thing to talk about. There are not many people of the generation that remember it. The right honourable gentleman served with distinction in the last war. I never killed anyone, but I wore uniform. But I was in London in the Blitz in 1940, living in the Millbank Tower where I was born. Some different ideas have come in since. And every night I went down to the shelter in Thames House. Every morning I saw Dockland burning. 500
in the red
people
suit.
Killed in Westminster one night by a landmine. Okay. It was terrifying. Aren't Arabs terrified? Aren't Iraqis terrified? Don't Arab and Iraqi women weep when their children die? Doesn't bombing strengthen their determination? What fools we are to live in a generation for which war is a computer game for our children and just an interesting little channel for news.
He's anti-gamer.
Every member of Parliament tonight who votes for the government motion will be consciously and deliberately accepting the responsibility for the deaths of innocent people if the war begins, as I fear it will. Now, that's for their decision to take. But this is a quite unique debate in my parliamentary experience where we're asked to share responsibility for a decision we won't really be taking with consequences for people who have no part to play in the brutality of the regime which we are dealing with. And I finish with this. On October the 24th, 1945, and the former Prime Minister from Bexley, Old Sidcup, will remember it, the United Nations Charter was passed. And the words of that charter etched into my mind and move me even as I think of them. We, the people of the United Nations, determined to save future generations, succeeding generations, from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has caused untold suffering to mankind. That was the pledge of that generation to this generation, and it would be the greatest betrayal of all if we voted to abandon the Charter and take unilateral action and pretend we were doing it in the name of the international community. And I shall vote against the motion.
I really love that speech from Tony Benn. It's really interesting to see these speeches too, in the context of what we now know about how the Iraq War did in fact play out, and how figures like Tony Benn and Jeremy Corbyn in the back there were proven so utterly correct about all this stuff. And these people were completely marginalized at the time and had no kind of political power. If talk about cancel culture now and talk about free speech, I don't know. This is one thing where I think my age is showing a little bit, because for me, nothing that we've seen recently comes close to what it was like between September 11th and a couple months into the Iraq War, where there was just 100% uniform agreement among the media, among the government, and any deviation from the narrative of we're going to war and this is happening, any deviation of that, people had their careers ruined, and were completely people were treated like they were anti-American. They were it was nothing that we've seen from a free speech standpoint, or in terms of cancel culture or whatever these fucking weirdos talk about now. Nothing we've seen really comes close to that. And I think that's one of the frustrating things for me about that whole situation. Not only were folks like Tony Benn and Jeremy Corbyn and the people that participated in this global anti-war movement, which was just one of the largest such social movements in history at that time. Not only were they completely ignored and marginalized, but all the people that did go along with this culture of cheerleading the whole thing, that created this whole situation intentionally. All these people, there was just zero consequences. All the people in the media just all continued to have positions in the media, in government. All the people that were responsible for this horrific crime, which we can now look in hindsight and see what it was for what it was. And there's just no one that was involved in creating that situation ever really had any career repercussions, let alone being held accountable for like multiple, millions of deaths and so much destruction and misery. That's been one of the really, you talk about the black pill. I mean, that's been one thing over the last 15, 20 years to see that play out. That's extremely demoralizing. Because when you realize too that as we head into the future, it's like that's the example of how elites get treated when they commit massive human rights crimes. Well, that doesn't give me a lot of hope that we're going to be able to hold people accountable for other very serious crimes that take place on this level, like the holding climate crisis abusers accountable, holding these big oil and energy companies accountable for deliberately causing this crisis and lying about it. Do we ever think that there's ever going to be any consequences for that? They deliberately covered up this thing that their scientists knew about and openly talked about. They deliberately covered it up. This is going to result in millions or possibly billions of deaths. Is anyone going to be held accountable for that? Probably not. And it's like judging just in our lifetimes, judging from what happened in the Iraq War is like a pretty good example, I think, of how much we can expect people at this elite level of society to actually be held accountable. Like people are talking about Donald Trump, like he's Donald Trump. Like, of course, nothing's going to happen to him. You just get to a certain point of like elite society and you just don't have consequences, no matter what crimes you're committing or how many billions of dollars you're stealing or how many millions of lives you're fucking ruining or destroying. But maybe we can change that. Maybe that is something we can change. As I talked about this the other day, but I think someone creating a political campaign based on, I want Nuremberg trials for like energy company CEOs and people that covered this up. If that was like a big part of their platform, like if you elect me, I'm going to fight to have like criminal trials for like energy CEOs that deliberately caused this crisis. Wouldn't people like respond to that probably pretty enthusiastically? I think so. Because like, listen, when we talk about how we can respond to the climate crisis and like, can we stop using fossil fuels? Can we actually develop the sort of technology to maintain our society while also not contributing the same amount of greenhouse gases and reverse this? It's extremely unlikely, folks. It's extremely unlikely. We're going to try, obviously, but it's really unlikely. But one thing that we could do that is like, that might be scientifically impossible, but one thing we could do is like actually try and hold the key people that created the situation accountable. That's something we could do. I don't know if every single human being can stop contributing fossil fuels, but we could just have trials for the people that knew this was happening and deliberately covered this up. I don't think that's too much to ask, right? I think that's the thing. I think someone should just run for something and have that be a big part of their platform and just see how people respond to it. I bet that would be pretty intriguing. And you're talking about people being responsible for the current direct where we are right now. Thatcherism was a huge part of creating these exact conditions.
The second thing is, despite the fact we've been told we're an entrepreneurial society, this is a country today that has an utter contempt for skill. You talk to people who dig coal, run trains, doctors, nurses, dentists, tool makers. Nobody in Britain is interested in them. The whole of this so-called entrepreneurial society has focused on the city news we get in every bulletin, telling us what's happened to the pound sterling to 3 points of decimals against a basket of European currencies. Skill is what built this country's strength, and it is treated with contempt. I must confess, the auctioning off of public assets, particularly the latest...
Corbin Grad, is that the Scottish lady that you just linked?
About the mentality of the minister who devised the scheme than it did about the sale itself. These are assets
we can watch that after.
By the labour of those who work in electricity and by the taxpayer who put the equipment in.
Yeah, so yeah, he's talking about
their price to make...
He's talking about the Thatcherite and Reaganite as obsession with like entrepreneurship and small businesses. We're talking about the NDP is doing still in 2021 still falling into this trap. I'm talking about small businesses. And what Tony Benn is doing here is connecting the language of entrepreneurship to the actual people that are working, the people doing physical labor, in order to doing this vital work. And that's something that we still have like so-called left-wing parties that are not able to be as clear about the same kind of economic system, which should be obvious to everyone, like where it's going at this point. And Tony Benn, what he's talking about as well here is talking about public ownership as well, and how taxpayers fund so much of this infrastructure, which is that's extremely relevant to the conversation we're having right now about telecom companies and how we're getting these telecom monopolies, vast telecom monopolies that provide terrible service for everyone at high prices, and how it's built on public infrastructure. That's Thatcherism and Reaganism, right? We've privatized all this public infrastructure. We've socialized the risk. We've socialized the investment, and we've privatized the profits. You know, he saw the writing on the wall right away. And we still have people now that aren't able to talk about this as clearly, as honestly. Yeah, and SpaceX and NASA as well.
Rich before the next election come. If these were local councillors, they would be before the courts for willful misconduct. And because they are ministers, and then some of them later go on the boards of the companies they've privatized, they are treated as businessmen who know better how to handle it as members of the board of directors than allegedly they did as ministers responsible.
I think where we get tripped up too is people can say, well, you know, our current system can't be fascism because I can still go and vote. I can still vote for different things, and it's not like completely authoritarian on me. Although as we're seeing, as we get further and more into these crises, it is becoming more authoritarian. So the mask is kind of slipping there. But I also have to think about, I think what we lose when we think about whether we're existing under fascism right now, what we lose is like, well, according to, you know, we watched Tony Benn's Iraq war speech. You know, go ask the people in Iraq if they think the United States is fascist. You know what I mean? It's like the United States government has been like arbitrarily inflicting whatever they want on the citizens of Iraq for decades now, and inflicting all kinds of like punishment and misery through sanctions and wars and the sectarian violence. And it's not like people in Iraq get to vote in the United States elections, you know, or Latin America or Vietnam. Exactly. So I think people think like, oh no, America, you call America fascist when you can go and walk around and say this stuff on social media, and you can go and vote and you can do this and that. But it's not necessarily about what you, a citizen, can or can't do, because your country is exporting your way of life violently all across the globe, and has been for like 70 years, that's pretty fascist, because that is authoritarianism. Because it's not like anyone in any of these countries that's affected by this imperialism or by the kind of exploitation. It's like they get a say in this process. Yeah, and that's another good point, is that what freedom of choice do we really have? And that's, you can't, as we've talked about repeatedly on this stream, like in the United States especially, there is like this national security establishment that has been in power basically for decades, like a shadow government basically, regardless of what party is actually in charge. The people that are actually in charge are like the weapons contractors and the Defense Department guys. Yeah, they're just good cop, bad cop hostage negotiations. Yeah, but there's things you can affect, right? We're seeing the difference right now, I think, between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. There's certainly a lot of things that are very similar, like the same between those two things, but there's certain things that are different. So you can have a say in certain aspects, but there are certain facets of the government, of the way things work, that you just have no input whatsoever on. Definitely. Yeah, people like Ben are all gone in the UK, and that's the thing. Jeremy Corbyn was one of those guys, and everyone, the UK establishment in the media and politics, did absolutely everything they could to ensure that there will never be another fucking one. And we'll see in the coming years and decades whether they succeeded in that. I suspect not, or I hope not, but they were certainly trying, right?
As members of the board of directors than allegedly they did as ministers responsible. Local government has been crippled. Across the river is the London County Council County Hall, the seat of government of the greatest city in the world, empty, to be sold, because the government wanted to cripple local government. And so indeed they have. The poll tax, the centralisation of the business rate, the punishment of the Liverpool and Lambeth councillors was to take all power from local government.
The shit about the spooks in the Democratic Party is absurd. Yeah.
Didn't believe in the role of the state. The undermining of the trade unions with less rights in Britain than they have in Eastern Europe. The tax cuts for the rich and benefit cuts for the poor. The censorship of the media. The abuse by the security services. The restriction of civil liberties. And when we look back on the 1980s, we will see many victims of market forces. I do not share the general view that market forces are...
I mean, this is fascinating to watch in 2021, because you see Ben is kind of talking to us from the past here and talking about how future generations are going to think about and talk about the deliberate choices that were made by these governments, which is what we're doing exactly right now at this moment. So we're getting a message from the past from Comrade Tony here. Do you think Nikki Ashton will run in the next NDP leadership race? I'm sure she will. I mean, I would want her to. Whether she will win is another thing. I just don't. I don't know. I don't know. Certainly, the NDP would be just as hostile to that as the Labour Party was to Jeremy Corbyn or the Democratic Party was to Bernie Sanders, though. Anyway, here's this message from the past about Tony Benn, about the decisions that the Thatcher government were taking during this period.
I do not share the general view that market forces are the basis of political civil liberties. And when we look back on the 1980s, we will see many victims of market forces. I do not share the general view that market forces are the basis of political liberty. Every time I see a person in a cardboard box in London, I say that person is a victim of market forces. Every time I see a pensioner who can't manage, a victim of market forces. The sick who are waiting for medical treatment that they could accelerate by private insurance, they are the victims of market forces. And with the disappearance of the Prime Minister, who was a great ideologue, I mean, her strength was that she understood a certain view of life. And when she goes and she's gone, there will be a great ideological vacuum. And as Opal's saying, we will run market forces better than she did, because her whole philosophy was that you measured the price of everything and the value of nothing. And we have to replace that. And I had one experience the other day which confirmed me in my view that she hasn't really changed the thinking or culture of the British people. I don't know how many people travel as I do on trains, but I go regularly on the trains and I see all the little businessmen with their calculators working out their cash flow, frowning people, looking and glaring at each other. Thatcherite trains, the train of the competitive society. But coming back from Chesterfield the other day, the train broke down. And on it wholly changed. Somebody came in, said, I have a cup of tea from my thermos. And then people looked after each other's children. And a young couple talked to me, and I said, after about half an hour, how long have you been married? Oh, we met on the train, they said. And a woman said, will you get off at Derby and ring my son in Swansea, because he'd be worried. By the time we got to London, we were a socialist train. Because you can't change human nature. There is good and bad in everybody, and for 10 years it is the bad and the good that has been denounced as lunatic, out of touch, cloud cuckoo land, extremist and militant.
Still happening.
That's what the party opposite have done. They don't quite yet know. They think it's the retirement of a popular headmistress under circumstances some might regret. Actually, they've killed the source of their own philosophy and opened the way for quite different ideas.
Yes, they had. Yes, they had, Tony. That is exactly what happened.
He was the aristocrat who fought tirelessly for the workers' cause. A hero to the left, critics, of course, saw him as an extremist who consigned Labour to the electoral wilderness. They all agree politics will be poorer without him. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon.
We've tried to make capitalism work with good and humane Labour
81.
governments, and we haven't succeeded because it can't work, because it rests on injustice.
Man,
it was 1981.
What kind of a different world would we be living in right now? This is a fun thing to think about, right? What kind of a different world would we be living in right now if at this time, 80, 81, if we had gone in the Tony Benn direction instead of the Thatcher direction? I don't know what the American version would be. Isn't it Mondale? Wasn't Mondale the guy that ran the one like left wing, or McGovern, the George McGovern direction? I think George McGovern's the guy that traumatized liberals for like 40 years because he got his ass kicked by Reagan, right? Am I getting my dates right? And then it's like, now we can never do like a left-wing campaign again because this one guy lost this one time, and then they can just lose repeatedly over and over and over again, and that's fine. But like, if you're like, maybe we should do like maybe we should be more of a left-wing party, they're like, are you crazy? You remember what happened to George McGovern? You can never go that direction. But it is like, yeah, they still talk about this to this day. It traumatized them. And that's why old liberals like Carville hated Bernie. Well, they hate him because they're paid to protect their class interests, but this is just the excuse that they use. Because these guys are probably smarter than this, I think, ultimately. They're just deliberately protecting their own class interests. But it really is fascinating to think. I talk about this all the time, how we're living in the consequences of all the decisions that were made at this exact time in 1980 about. It's really what the political revolution in 1980 of Thatcher and Reagan created the world that we live in now. Because when you think about politics like that, it doesn't really work on like a quarter by quarter basis. Like they were really like making an impact that wouldn't be felt for generations with their campaign of like privatization and lower tax rates, and destroying public services and the welfare state. They won so much in the 80s that they also created the whole, like they traumatized liberals so much, like with McGovern, that liberals basically bought into a lot of the premises that they were like articulating, like in terms of the economy. And so you ended up just being with liberals, just basically agreeing with most of what the Reaganites and the Thatcherites believe, but like with maybe we believe in having a slightly bigger social safety net or a few minor tweaks within this like market-based system. You see like Obama as an example of that, or Joe Biden. But it really is when you think about how we're living in the political and economic consequences of these big decisions that were being made at this exact time in the early 80s, what this world would be like if we had been listening to Tony Benn at that time, or if we had been, if we had gone in the opposite direction. I'm surprised Social Security still exists, considering how much they hate disabled people. Yeah, but older boomers are part of their political coalition, so they got to keep them in the fold. All the boomers that like they benefited from all these systems throughout their 20s and 30s and 40s, and then they get into their 60s, they get Social Security, and then they yank up the ladder for the next generations. That's what Thatcherism and Reaganism was all about, right? We're yanking up the ladder behind us that used to exist, that would like allow for some kind of like economic mobility. That's just not going to exist anymore, but we're going to be taken care of. So that's why you still have Social Security for older people, because they're like, well, whatever, we deserve it. We're hardworking. Unlike this new generation, they're not hardworking. But really, like, they've taken away all the opportunities, all the jobs, all the housing, all the public services, the welfare state, all that shit. So it's interesting to think about this time of the early 80s and what some of these guys were saying and how different things would be now if we had listened to the Tony Benns of the world.
Some Labour MPs were already preparing to defect from Michael Foot's Labour to form the short-lived Social Democratic Party. Many more would have left, changing the party forever if Tony Benn had beaten the right-wing former Chancellor Dennis Healey in the contest for the deputy leadership. Dennis Healey won by the tiniest of margins.
Tony Benn, 49.574. Dennis Healey, 50.426.
It would be nearly 30 years before Labour elected a leader Tony Benn voted for. He'd known both brothers since they were boys.
David I associate very much with the Tony Blair and the New Labour. Edward not quite so much, indeed not at all. And so I see them...
Ed Miliband is kind of underrated.
In the party.
Ed Miliband could be better, I think.
Tony Benn struggled to escape not poverty, but privilege.
Justin Motes.
He was the son of a Labour hereditary peer. He became a viscount when his father died in 1960 and had to fight to change the law so he could shed the title and return to the House of Commons.
You see, the first Jew had to fight to get in, the first Catholic had to fight to get in, the first atheist had to fight to get in, and I've no doubt we shall create a precedent.
Anthony Wedgwood Benn was a passionate supporter of Harold Wilson and in the forefront of his attempt to brand Labour, the party for the modern age.
It's got an advantage which many people have urged in the past. You can pick it up easily.
In the 1970s, his politics moved to the left.
Something I'm worried about is that after the actions against Corbyn and Ashton, this future generation of leftists will take weaker stances on anti-imperialism and hard left politics. I think that's definitely the goal, right? That is the goal. You have to destroy anyone that goes down that road. And you have to call them a terrorist supporter and an authoritarian and a dictator supporter and human rights denier and genocide denier and all this stuff. You have to absolutely or racist or anti-Semite or as they did with Jeremy Corbyn. You have to destroy them so people don't get any smart ideas. And that's why I talk often about the importance of pushing back on that kind of stuff and not as AOC did earlier, like when we talked about Jeremy Corbyn, not kind of equivocate and be like, oh, both sides and I don't want to offend anyone. That's why it's so important to put your foot down when these kind of smear campaigns are happening and just and stand up for each other, because that's how we push back against that, right? Is if we have solidarity with each other, if we stand up for each other. But we have a lot of people, I think, that fall into wanting to appeal to everyone, or they fall into these kind of smear campaigns and they don't want to be smeared to the same extent, so they're afraid to kind of take these forceful positions. And that's why I feel that I need to do that personally myself, to hope that it influences some people or convinces some people that they can take that kind of a stance as well, because it's not always easy, but we can do that kind of shit. And forcefully push back on that kind of narrative if we stand together and stand up for each other.
Left, and he became plain Tony Benn. When Margaret Thatcher threw Labour into opposition in the 1979 general election, he was fully reborn as a tribune of the left. He said Labour lost elections because policies like nationalisation, nuclear disarmament and withdrawal from Europe were forever being dropped from the manifesto.
Withdrawal from Europe, that's
responsible now for 5 years to see the policies develop in the subcommittees, come to the executive, go to the unions for consultation, be discussed in the liaison committee with the unions, come to conference, be endorsed. And then I have seen them cast aside in secret by those who are not accountable to this movement.
Michael Foot's 1983 manifesto was the closest Labour got to his beliefs.
Tony Benn is out of the House of Commons.
But the party crashed at the election. He lost his seat and Labour began a journey back in the other direction. When Tony Blair was in power, he was a fixture of street protests, marching for jobs against the Iraq War, even visiting Baghdad.
That's based Tony Benn.
Does Iraq possess weapons of mass destruction?
Iraq has no weapons of mass destruction whatsoever.
We ignored Tony Benn for 20 years, and he was right every single step of the way. And there he is, trying to save our asses again. In 2001, 2002, he gets ignored for 20 years, and he's like, "No, okay, can we do this again? Will you listen to me this time? Will you listen to me this time?" And we were like, "No, we will not." And yet again, Tony Benn was proven 100% correct in everything that he was saying. So that's 40 fucking years of being correct, of correctly pointing out the structural issues that our economic goals were creating, and imperialist goals, and no one listening, and just having everything get worse. And we got to talk about this Iraq War shit in the context of the current new Cold War with China as well too, because we see people that should know better getting pulled into this, and we got to stop this. We got to stop participating in this. It's really stupid that we're still helping the exact same people do the exact same horrible shit.
Comrades, this is
In one of his last public appearances, he opposed military action against Syria.
And I've been on this platform over many years, from the time of Suez onwards, over
2013,
years,
still correct.
We found that we have lost the battle.
He published 8 volumes of diaries.
2013.
Basement for years.
Still correct.
Squirreled archives.
Still marginalized. Still not listened to.
I got that idea as a pilot. You sat there and you had things on all 3 sides and on the ceiling. So if you suddenly want to find out,
you don't miss, folks.
It's easier to look there than find something else.
In old age, he toured the country, pulling in the sort of audiences that might once have demonised him, but who now hungered for a politics untouched by focus groups.
I was once the most dangerous man in Britain, and now I'm described as a national treasure.
So we're coming down now to the sewage ejector plant.
Tony Benn mocked Parliament's pretensions in a TV documentary.
This is what, how old then?
About 1887.
That would have taken Mr. Gladstone's excavate out of the building.
Just about, I would think, yes.
He regularly took his political message to the Glastonbury Festival. Nowhere was out of bounds, and nothing dimmed his faith that his ideas would have their day. A few years ago, he recorded this message for his own obituary.
As by definition, I won't be able to say this again. Can I take this opportunity of thanking my family, my mother and father and my 2 brothers, and above all Caroline, who inspired me over the 50 years of our marriage, and my children and grandchildren, all the many, many other people.
He's so sweet.
Supported me, encouraged me, and taught me so much. And I hope that in return I encouraged them, and that I didn't give offence, because I tried to speak my mind, and that's what you have to do in politics. So thank you very much. Well, I'll check that on transmission.
Man, we got to start listening to the Tony Benns of the world, folks. Like, please.
This is an evasion of ministerial responsibility on a matter of public policy. Now, of course, we've discussed so much the conduct of ministers, we've somewhat forgotten that this whole story...
He was talking about arms sales to Iraq.
...record of British relations in the Middle East, which my honourable friend is going to raise again on Friday. Iraq was part of the world we took over when the Ottoman Empire disappeared. Britain bombed Iraq with chemical weapons in the 1920s, and a few months ago the Queen Mother put up a statue to the man who did it. Bomber Harris was the squadron leader who used chemical weapons against Iraq.
Like, okay, incredible, right off the bat. Like, think about also, we talked about, when you were talking about colonialism in the British Empire, remember we were talking about how that, like, in Britain especially, there's still that kind of nationalism is really encouraged. That whole thing about the sun never sets on the British Empire, and how you're supposed to look back on the accomplishments of the British Empire as being something that you're proud of, something incredible. That's really pervasive in the UK, and that's exactly why they hated Corbyn, right? Because Corbyn is from this tradition as well, and he criticizes correctly and denounces their history of colonialism and ethnic cleansing and genocide and violence and exploitation. But, like, it's not, in the UK, it's not easy to, like, take this stance, I think, because it's really, like, this is really, really frowned upon, like, denouncing the empire and denouncing the colonialist tradition like this. Like, this is what really, like, pisses people off, because people have been told from the time that they were kids that they should be proud of that legacy. And we see that here in Canada as well. We see that if you question our colonial legacy now, people get so defensive about it. But I think during the height of Thatcherism and in the 90s and the New Labour era, I mean, it was even more difficult to criticize that legacy. But anyway, the way that he's talking about Iraq and tying it to their legacy of colonialism is really interesting.
We planned to occupy Kuwait in 1958, and it all came out with the papers when Selwyn Lloyd wrote to Foster Dulles and said, we might take over Kuwait as a crown colony. And the double standards of British policy in the Middle East is the thing that will be noticed by anyone in the Arab world who reads this debate. We didn't take the view we did about Kuwait when Turkey invaded Cyprus, when the occupied territories were taken over by Israel. This Gulf War, looked at in the light of what we now know, was a war for profit, a war for oil, and a war for the control of the area. And now, we are suddenly told that ministers who protested so vigorously about their defense of democracy and human rights were selling weapons to Saddam Hussein, who was repressing Kurds and Shiites before and after the war, and then saying it was just a question of flexible guidelines. 200,000 Iraqis were killed last year by forces including our own. 150,000 Iraqi babies under 5 were expected to die by the Harvard medical team that looked at the bombing of the water supply by British, American and French bombers. And it is an act of odious hypocrisy then to come along, as honourable members have said, and say, but of course our industry needs the orders, people want the jobs. You remember the joke about the man producing nuclear weapons in America, and somebody said, how could you do it? And he said, well, the man's got to live, hasn't he? And that is the argument, that somehow you can justify the supply of weapons in that way. The international arms trade is a greater threat to world peace than the AIDS.
We need this now, and we needed this in the 80s.
By governments. It props up dictators, the Shah, Batista, Marcos, Papadoc, all these people, Pinochet, props them up, and they get the weapons to crush their own people in the interests of keeping down their own people so that the multinationals can make a profit from
we need this so badly.
Superpowers that sell them the
weapons. No one is doing this.
Because they bought
not even Bernie, not anyone.
Into trouble with the IMF, and the IMF comes along and says, cut your social budgets because you've got to pay the debt on the arms you bought to keep down your own people. And of course the waste of skill. Some of the most brilliant scientists and engineers in the world are working on methods of death instead of the means of life. And billions and billions and billions of pounds are wasted on weapons that could have saved lives. And a heavy responsibility rests upon everybody, and I know every government to some extent has done it, who promotes the international arms trade. Because there have been 134 wars since 1945. Millions have died in them, using weapons that were supplied by the superpowers very often. And millions more died because they were denied the resources that were wasted in the arms program itself. Ministers will not tell the House the truth on this matter. Ministers use intelligence, and everybody knows it, we've had a reference to it, and are prepared to sacrifice intelligent people to conceal the truth. This is a matter the House should deal with by select committee. Look at Oliver North. They had him up before a congressional committee and they grilled him for weeks on it, on Watergate. When Peter Wright wrote a book saying he'd committed treason, they spent millions of pounds trying to prevent the book getting into the hands of the British people. The central question is, who is allowed to buy the weapons? Who controls it? Who knows?
Okay, a couple things here. Naomi Klein was right on her podcast when she said the American left was not organized enough to make any use of a Sanders presidency, even if he did win in 2020. I mean, I think that argument is interesting. I mean, it's certainly, no, they weren't organized on the ground enough. Like I keep saying with Bernie, the interesting thing would have been if Bernie had been president, if he had been able to like pressure people like Joe Manchin or Kristen Sinema to go along with his agenda, or get people to protest or to like pressure them. That was the whole kind of plan that was going to make him different, that was going to like try and like force people to go along with what their citizens want. And I think there was a good a chance as any that might have worked. I would have liked to have seen someone try that approach rather than just arbitrarily capitulating to people. But definitely there needs to be way more like on the ground organization to be really, really politically effective. Yeah, because the history's so connected, we get these jerks being like, how did we get here? Yeah, we did this. History did this. This is the results of imperialism that's happening to this day. It's disgusting. And this is what I was saying earlier, Aislinn. I don't know if you were around, but that's the really frustrating thing, is being able to see this happening throughout the years and comparable events, and seeing people like Tony Benn, who were 100% correct the entire time, who at that time were kind of ostracized, they were marginalized, they weren't really given the same platform, they were called like, radicals or whatever, dismissed. We can look back on that now and see, okay, well, this person was 100% correct. If we had listened to him, so much better things would have happened. But like, that doesn't seem to change the course that we're on now, and it doesn't seem to change any of this, and we still keep making the same mistakes, and we still keep making the same terrible decisions. And when people like Tony Benn come along that are like, no, I'm against this, here's exactly why I'm against it, they're again marginalized and treated like cuckoos and radicals, and the people that make these decisions just have no consequences, and this just seems to perpetuate endlessly. It's like, that's the frustrating thing about getting older and seeing some of these conversations just continually play out and have the same fucking people be wrong each time. The people in the media, the people in politics, and there's no consequences. They just fail upwards. They keep being put in positions to make similar or worse mistakes. And the people that are opposed to this stuff get called radicals, and they get excluded from the discourse, and they get canceled or whatever. And this just happens throughout history, basically, throughout this whole last 40-year period that we keep talking about. Yeah, conservatives like O'Toole moaning about Canada's inability to manufacture vaccines after supporting NAFTA his whole life. Yeah, I've spent my whole career like trying to dismantle any kind of public infrastructure to do this kind of stuff. But then when a crisis happens and I need this public infrastructure to be there in order to like help people, it's like, where did it go? What happened? We need this. Whose fault is this? It's like, well, it's your fault. It's your fault. I wonder if this is the path forward for leftism in North America, destroying the illusion of exceptionalism with foreign policy talk, and then people will be more willing to accept that our domestic policies suck too. And listen, I don't know if it's the path forward, because like people, I was talking about the UK and the way that you're kind of supposed to worship the British Empire in the UK, and how that's really ingrained in people, and it offends them personally when you criticize that, because it sounds like when you criticize the UK or colonialism, you're like offending them personally. And that happens in America as well. And in many ways, like that makes it difficult to take these stances. That's why you get ostracized. But I think like regardless of whether it's like the way forward, I think just like morally, it's what you should do if you're in a position where you have a platform like in the media or in politics. It's just morally, because that's the morally correct stance. But I do think that it's true that if more people take that stance and more people feel emboldened to openly criticize these things, criticize these like historical traditions, and criticize these institutions, it's going to create more space for, I think, people to like be able to make these same kind of criticisms like in their own situations. And it's going to lead to more people to realize that it's acceptable and in fact favorable to make these kind of comparisons. But that's it. It's like you take stances like this when it's going on, when it's like what Tony Benn is doing now, and it's not popular at the time, and we can look back on it 20 years later, 30 years later, and talk about how correct it is, but it doesn't seem to actually like it's not easy in that moment, to take these kind of stances. And we have to learn from people like Tony Benn that like we need to do it regardless of like what the social cost is, what the career cost is. History will absolve me. That's it. That's the attitude we all have to take.
What happens? Who tells the truth? And finally, does the House take the responsibility for holding government accountable? Or does it shuffle it off like so much else to a commission here, an agency there, or a High Court judge there? Because if it does that, we shall be burying this House as a historic defender of the rights of the people we represent, some of whom were sent to fight in Iraq against an army we had armed.
Yeah, like we need way more of this. We need way more of this. All right, that's the end of the video, everyone. Thank you for watching it. If you haven't already, hit the thumbs up, hit the bell, leave a comment or whatever, or don't, and I'll talk to you soon. Okay? All right, bye.